Welcome back, everyone. And for those who might just be joining us, either here in the room or online via the streaming link, let me introduce myself. My name is Winston C. Thompson. I'm the coordinator of this event and the moderator for this session. Over the last year or so, we've been having community conversations here at OSU about the shared values that unite us in our work, in our learning, and in our living here as members of this community. Today's keynote and subsequent conversation fit nicely in that ongoing series. This session anchors so much of what we're focused upon for this miniature conference here today. It would be impossible to discuss claims of division and discord within education without attending to the ways that these worries manifest in public discussions of university campuses. The claims of political bias, from claims of political bias to calls that some speech be certainly censored or possibly protected, higher education has become a contested territory in the fight for the hearts and minds of current and future acting citizens. To make sense of this landscape, I'm hard-pressed to think of anyone with greater expertise than today's keynote speaker, Dr. Sigal Ben-Porath. Dr. Ben-Porath is a professor of the University of Pennsylvania's Graduate School of Education, in addition to appointments in philosophy, political science, etc. Broadly speaking, Professor Ben-Porath's work, which has been more widely celebrated than I have the time to fully recount for you here this morning, the work focuses on democratic theory and practice, and it studies the ways that institutions, like schools and colleges, can sustain and advance democracy. Relevant to today's subjects, she is the author of the 2017 book, Free Speech on Campus, and the soon-to-be-released Cancel Wars, How Universities Can Foster Free Speech, Promote Inclusion, and Renew Democracy. And I should say, it's available wherever you get fine books, right? So please, do join me in giving a very warm Buckeye welcome to our keynote speaker, Dr. Sigal Ben-Porath.
Thank you so much, Winston, for the warm welcome and for the invitation to this event. And thank you, Piers and Aaron and everyone, Kate, of course, everyone who has a hand in organizing this very exciting day of conversation. I'm very grateful to be here and definitely grateful to be here in person. So this is the topic for the day overall. Should education be less divisive? And my spoiler alert at the bottom is that generally yes, but I have some caveats. So that's why it's going to take me more than 1 minute to go through the answer. I was here what feels like 100 years ago before the pandemic to speak about my 2017 book, Free Speech on Campus. So some of you were here. I visited here a few years back, whenever that was. I'm going to put on my timer so that I don't take forever. So, of course, we fixed that. There is no more issues of free speech. So this book that is coming out in a couple weeks, once paper is available for printing books, is really trying to situate the questions of campus free speech that I've dealt with and that I will discuss a little bit as we go along this morning. It's trying to situate it within the broader context of a democratic backsliding. And so generally my plan for this morning is to talk about, first, about polarization and the current state of democracy in very broad terms, to try to situate the question of division or divisiveness in education within the broader context of extremism, radicalization, and polarization in our democratic society. And then I want to talk about what I see as the two main impacts of this state of polarization on democracy as a concept and as a reality in this country. And the two impacts really have to do with, on the one hand, knowledge and truth, and on the other hand, inclusion and belonging. And then I will try to suggest the ways in which these matters are affecting schools and universities. We've heard some about that this morning already, for those of you who were here. And then to talk a little bit about what they can do in response. And so my overall claim is that education needs to be less divisive in this country, that there are ways to make it less divisive and to use it in the process of overcoming polarization and backsliding, but it takes a lot of work. So that's basically going to be the constructive argument towards the end. So let me start off by saying a few words about polarization. So there's a lot of lines here, and it's not really for all the details of the data, but for a general argument that I want to make. And the general argument is as follows. Polarization is in a paradoxical state in this country. Generally speaking, for the most part, citizens in this country are not very polarized about policy issues. So we really share a lot of perspectives, or there is a lot of overlap in our views about what government needs to do, what are the appropriate actions or policies for for Congress, for the executive branch, etc. There is some division, but it's not very pronounced, and I'll offer some caveats in a few minutes. But despite the fact that we are not very polarized about the substance, right, about the direction that policies have to take, we are quite polarized about each other, right? And so, in other words, our feelings, this is what this line is showing here going up, our feelings towards people who vote differently from us, or whose ideology is opposite than ours, are increasingly negative. They are increasingly related to other aspects of our identities. And what Liliana Mason, this is from her book, I disrespectfully agree, which I think is a marvelous title for a marvelous book. She's saying our identities are basically coalescing around our ideologies. So if I know one thing about your identity, such as where do you live, what food do you like, what sports do you watch, what is your religion, etc., I can guess your ideological positioning, right? And so these are sort of like mega identities that are developing in the country and are encompassing political ideologies and creating greater and greater negative emotions towards people in the out party or people who are different than me in these ways. And what really basically all of this slide is meant to tell you is that polarization is not so much in our heads, it's in our hearts, right? Polarization is a state that is visceral right now. And I think we have to take that into account when we are trying to think about ways to address it. Why are we polarized? Again, there's a huge literature on that. I'm not going to go through all of this, but I want to say just basically one key point. Some people suggest that political elites are causing polarization, right? And so in other words, that there are incentives in our political structure for politicians and for parties to become more and more extreme, right? For example, the Electoral College and the way in which each state gives all of its votes, almost every state gives all of its vote to the one who wins, 51%, or the way that we redistrict and create gerrymandered and monochromatic districts so that elected officials really have to cater just to their base and not consider every opinion or broader opinions. So structural reasons lead to polarization. This is one view. And therefore, the solution for polarization is structural as well. For example, some people say, oh, we need to do redistricting reform. Of course, good luck. I mean, it's in front of the Supreme Court this term, so I don't know. Or we need to do ranked choice voting, or we need to do various structural reforms in order to address polarization. But on the other hand, there is a lot of data to also suggest that it's not just the elites that are polarized, it's the population that is polarized, right? And so, for example, again, for those of you who were here, the story about the one activist who really created the whole CRT fight around the country right now, which we'll talk about here as well. Of course, there is the one guy, and he's maybe a political elite of some sort, and he's propagating a lot of that. But there is so many people who are buying into that, right? There are so many people who are willing to go along with that. So polarization, even if it's guided from above, it really is, as I was trying to say, in our hearts. It's in our political individual biases against each other, as I said, in terms of how we view people in the out party. It's contagious, right? And it's contagious through conversations with each other, and it's also contagious, and I won't go into that too much, through the algorithms that are directing the information to which we are exposed online. If this is true, as I suggest, then the reform we need in order to address polarization is not only just structural, right? As I said, voting reforms, etc., is also social and institutional, right? So what we need to do in order to become less polarized is to figure out ways to overcome individual biases and individual differences in the way in which we view each other. Okay, so all of this is affecting schools in some ways, and we, again, have talked about it a little bit, and that's our topic for the whole day. But I do want to note that despite polarization and despite the division regarding educational policies, we are still seeing significant trust in public schools. And Professor Jeffries this morning said, it's like Congress, right? I hate Congress, I love my congressman, right? I don't believe in public schools. The public school system is terrible, but our local school, I love it, right? And we definitely see it in pollings and surveys. That this one is from last month. So it's basically telling us that a small majority of adults in this country have trust in their public schools, right, in the community's schools, and have trust in teachers. And this goes up when you ask parents of public school children. So, and then it breaks down, so it's unequal racially, as you can anticipate, right? White parents have some more trust, and non-white, all different non-white groups have lower trust at various levels. But we still see that there is significant trust in our own teachers and our own schools. And so this is just something to keep in mind. There is a lot of polarization about schools and within schools, but there is still significant levels of trust that we can find in the education system. Okay. So colleges are not as lucky. So the division around higher education is actually way more significant than the division around the public schools. I don't know exactly what happened in 2016, but something happened, and it's creating increasingly negative views about higher education. This is driven by political elites, but it's really being taken up by partisans, right? And so people who identify as Republican or leaning Republican, so also independents who tend to vote Republican, they are developing more and more negative views about higher education, whereas Democrats are really, and leaning Democrats are really feeling still quite positive. The issue about this is really that we cannot stay above the fray, right? And that's the real point here. We cannot stay in our ivory towers. We cannot pretend like this is not affecting us or not relating to us. We are just gonna sit here in our seminar rooms and talk about ideas. Love doing that. I am a philosopher, but we cannot escape the kind of turmoil that is affecting this country. And I'm just gonna make it go worse and worse for a couple more slides, and then it's gonna turn around and start getting better. So just prepare yourself. Okay, so speech and polarization about speech within the context of higher education is also increasing. This is a controversy from 6 months ago, but, right, 6, yeah. But it's a very live and fresh right now. This is an event that took place at the invitation and organization of the Federalist Society at the Yale Law School. The Federalist Society, for those who don't know, is a conservative organization operating in law schools and also responsible for a lot of efforts in judicial reform and nominations around the country. And so they organized an event, and to the event, the event is moderated by a faculty person who you will hear in a second, and she is moderating a conversation between speakers from two organizations. One organization is more progressive and the other is more conservative. And the conservative organization, that's the crux of the shouting you'll hear in a second, is one of the organizations that is promoting the and supporting the anti-transgender laws that are being passed in different states around the country. And so there are students here who are in disagreement about this, the invitation of this representative. Okay, let's see if I actually know what to do here. So they're standing in protest.
Am I the girl what?
Are you the one who sent the trap house email?
No, I didn't send a trap house email. He did. He sent the trap house email. And I corrected him.
Can I ask you all, as you know, Yale has a policy of freedom of speech. And that
Yale has a policy.
Guys, come on, throw off.
This is
He
told you, Monica Miller, this is what it would be. Will those trans kids grow up?
You guys,
This is
I
free
look forward to
speech.
hearing
This
from
is
you
free
when we
speech.
get to question and answer.
Free speech is
Why
what
are
you're
allowed
allowed
to
to
talk here and we're
No,
allowed
you're
to protest?
disrupting the free speech.
You're disrupting us.
Get on with
This
it.
is louder.
If I
So, okay, this goes on for a while, and you're not going to understand a lot more words. But basically, the disagreement is about whether the protest that they are engaged in is considered a form of speech that is protected by Yale's policies, or whether just the people on the podium should enjoy the freedom to express their diverse views about the topic of the anti-trans laws. The reason that this controversy from 6 months ago, which is like forever in the, in this type of thing, and in the media cycle, the reason that it's still alive is that one federal judge last week said that he's not going to hire any clerks from Yale Law School because this is the kind of environment that is stifling diverse speech, that he's by his interpretation. And so if you go as a student to study at Yale Law School, clearly you hate free speech, and so he's not going to hire you. And there seem to be some additional people who are joining this, additional federal judges who are joining the same position, although so far anonymously. So, so what can be said on college campuses is really being affected by the polarized atmosphere about our views on trans issues, our views on free speech, our views on higher education, etc. And I think this is getting close to the last depressing one. Oh no, I have one more after that. So we also disagree about how to respond to people and how to understand a response to people who are transgressing, right? So, people on one side of the aisle will say, if you are punishing, if you are responding and acting against people who are transgressing, you are punishing speech in an unjustified way. And people on the left side are saying, no, if you are responding to transgressing speech, you are holding people accountable, right? So even how do we understand our responses, such as protests, online exposure of people, and other types of response to people who are transgressing or overstepping what we see as the appropriate boundaries of speech? How do we understand our responses? Even that is not seeing eye to eye. So polarization about all of these issues, top to bottom, is quite significant and, as I said, quite visceral. All of this is really affecting, that's what I want to argue, is really affecting the foundations of democracy, right? And so truth, or what do we know, right? What we are able to learn, and inclusion, or who belongs in our community. These are two cornerstones of democratic theory and practice, which are significantly affected by these struggles around polarization. And both of them happen to be part of the core mission of educational institutions, right? So both of them really are affecting the way that learning institutions are operating, and the fact that polarization is chipping away at these foundational concepts of democracy is also getting our learning institutions caught up, as I tried to suggest, in significant ways in this fray. So I want to talk a little bit about each of these, and then go back to talking about schools. So the matter of democracy and truth seems, okay, just a little primer on that. It seems to be cut and dry. And again, those of you who were here this morning, right, Professor McAvoy was saying, first we need to understand the facts of history in the case of this conversation, and then we can deliberate about policies. Professor Jeffries was saying, this is what happened and this is what didn't happen, and we have to agree about the facts. And I agree with all of that, but I do want to just note that more broad, and definitely to agree with that in the context of a college classroom that has a very strong, or a K-12 classroom that has a very strong grounding in fact and truth. But I do want to say that in democracy more broadly, we do have an ongoing struggle regarding the place of truth, where we can find truth for the purpose of democratic practice, right? And just to be a little bit overly simplistic about this, a popular view of democracy would locate facts and knowledge and understanding within the populace, right? Everyone has access to it. Whereas a more technocratic view of democracy, or maybe bureaucratic view of democracy, or structural view of democracy, will say that really we are providing or enabling experts, people in position of power, to be able to make decisions for us because they know, right? They have access to more scientific data. They have access to better, anything from intelligence sources, if it has to do with national security, or CDC reports, if it's about public health. And so they know and they make decisions for us. And we, of course, can have views about that, but generally this is where the power to know and to act on knowledge lies. And these are two overall legitimate views of democracy, right? The more popular one and the more technocratic one. These are views of democracy that have been in circulation throughout the existence of democratic societies. And, we go back and forth between them. And the challenge to who qualifies as an expert or where we can find facts is an ongoing challenge that is coming from different ideological positions. Let me give you an example. Who has knowledge? Who can point me in the direction of accurate facts? What qualifies as good evidence, right? We can have an argument, for example, about whether one's lived experience qualifies as reliable fact that merits inclusion within official forms of knowledge, right? And I think this is an interesting and legitimate argument. It's mostly coming from, the effort to include more voices in our process of learning and knowledge development, right? Saying, look, this might be the perspective from on high, but here are people living in communities that are affected, and you got to listen to them, right? Lived experience has something to do with what we know and what we need to know. So this is a part of the fight over democratic knowledge, truth, and expertise, right? Right now, my sense is that this argument, which again, legitimate, ongoing critique of expertise, questions about the possibilities of popularization of knowledge, and even in the history of this country, not unheard of to valorize anti-intellectualism, sort of like more ground level understandings, So this too is not new. But I think right now, the rejection of evidentiary practices, the rejection of the possibility of knowing facts from fiction is really reaching a more pitched level, right? Along with the polarization discussion that we are having this morning. So even like do your own research, right? It's really not a call that supports research. It's a call that rejects, if you're familiar with this pretty annoying online phrase, it's a call that says, oh, the CDC says that the vaccines are good. Do your own research, meaning watch YouTube videos, and then you will find out that actually vaccines are killing so many people, right? So you will have access to mostly fictional sets of evidence. And so the whole notion that the scientific method or evidentiary practices are able to provide us with a better grounded knowledge is really being rejected. And I want to suggest that this is really an effort to create an alternative, not only just an alternative reality, but also an alternative form of governance, right? So it's really tying together our access to knowledge and truth with our capacity to govern ourselves as a society. When we have access to good knowledge, to factual, at least best, the best facts that we can get, whether, again, it's about public health or about whatever other topic, the elections, etc., and we continue to refuse to accept them, right, despite the best evidence, this really goes beyond the basic educational effort to introduce, to provide access to real grounded knowledge, and it really requires engagement at the more emotional level that is trying to address willful ignorance. Willful ignorance by Charles Mill's definition, and ignorance that fights back, right? You could know, but you choose not to know, right? Because of other incentives or other preferences that that are stronger than any evidence that I can show you. So the epistemic foundations really are fraying, and we need them, right? We can't, people can argue whether polarization is good or bad, and I'm going to say something about this in a moment, but we really need a shared set of facts. And the reality that large majorities of both countries say that we cannot agree on basic facts is unsustainable, right? This is something that we have to fix, and it's something that schools theoretically could fix. If I didn't know better, I would have said, oh, schools should fix it. That's the end of my talk. But of course, it's harder than that. We are hampered in our capacity to fix this matter in schools. I have to use this slide every talk that I give because I think it's the best. I love this guy. This is this guy from Juneau, in case you don't know. Juneau, Alaska is having, in 2007 or 6, the Olympic torch is passing through town, and the school is sending all the kids out to sort of wave little flags and, for the TV cameras. And here is this one crazy guy. He's a troublemaker, so that's why I love him. And he's unfurling this big banner that says, "Bong hits for Jesus." What that means, nobody knows, including him. But the principal suspends him. She's tired of his antics, and she's suspending him. And so he claims First Amendment protections. This goes all the way up to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court says, nah, you can be suspended, it's fine. Why? You're advocating drug use. Okay. They could have gone for the church and state thing. They went for the drug use. Fine. So it's a little funny, but it's also really sad. And the reason that it's really sad is that this is capping 4 decades of silencing minors, silencing young people in schools, right? There was a small reversal last year with the cheerleader case. I won't go into that. Very tiny reversal. But broadly speaking, the court is permitting teachers, administrators to silence young people and to notify them that their voices are actually not protected, not included in our public debate. They should sit quietly, no need to deliberate, sorry, right? You should, and definitely not say anything hard or difficult or controversial. Be quiet and listen to your teacher. And this really is, in my view, part of this ongoing process of democratic backsliding. If people don't practice their capacity to use their voice, to use their brain, to develop their ideas, right, to engage with each other across differences, whether ideological differences or all sorts of differences, right, they cannot really become the kind of citizens that we're looking for them to be. And of course, when they then come to college as a freshman and we throw them into, you know, like the seminar room or the debate, you know, the clubs and the dorms, and we say, oh, by the way, good luck. Everyone here is different and there are various opinions. Enjoy yourself. Goodbye. Right? So this is, you know, people have no training to do that because we took away the training for 4 decades. And now we're doing even worse, right? Sorry that this looks like a huge big jumble. That's how angry I am. So this is a picture from 2 weeks ago in Florida, a classroom library. Not only is it taped over, the books are turned back so that you can't even see the titles of the books that you're not allowed to read. It's a middle school classroom in Florida right now. And all schools in Florida, most, I shouldn't say all, most schools in Florida, K through 12, this is what their libraries look like. Why? So that you don't get to think about the ideas that you're not allowed to think about, right? You don't even know what they are. Just to say what this big mess is, this is a list of the laws and legislative efforts around the country to disallow CRT, sex ed, you know, pronoun use, all of the things that the legislatures are worried about, including in Ohio, in Pennsylvania, where I'm from, both of which haven't passed yet, and other states where it has passed. And over here is just a list of the most commonly banned books, the ones that are turned back here. These most commonly banned books are mostly about gender and sexual identity or orientation, and then in addition to that, some books about immigrants and the immigrant experience, and of course, books about American history as it relates especially to race. So not so great where we are right now. And this really is coming to tell you that the effort to limit our knowledge and the effort to stem or restrict what we are able to know in education, in classrooms, K-12 and higher ed, is tightly linked to the question of who belongs, right? What you're not allowed to know over here is all about the people who don't belong in the community by this view, right? People of immigrant descent, or of racial minorities, especially Black Americans, and people of diverse gender and sexual orientation. And so the question of who belongs really is a question about the boundaries of knowledge, right? These two are tied together and are undermining our democratic practice. democratic inclusion that I want to make the case for here, so this is where I'm trying to be constructive now for the last part of the talk. Democratic inclusion in learning communities is necessary, not just to be touchy-feely or to be nice to everyone, although listen, being nice to everyone is, I'm for that. It's a good plan anywhere and definitely in a learning community. But really we have to understand that this is not just about being nice or civil. This is about having access to knowledge that we are being robbed of when we are excluding people from our communities. And so the epistemic injury that kids who are transgender or kids who are gay or kids who are members of various minorities in class or in society, right? Because it's the same case where all of the children are black, for example. They still can't learn. It's not just if you're a minority in your class. It's minority more broadly speaking. The epistemic injury that you are experiencing is not just that it hurts your feelings. The problem is that your voice is being silenced, right? With your identity being rejected, your voice is being silenced. And the knowledge that comes with it, the knowledge that exists in your community, really vanishes from public display. It's becoming invisible, right? And so epistemic equality, or equality of knowing, equality of the knowers, those who know, right, is necessary in schools as a first step towards democratic renewal. We have to recognize that every person in our seminar room, in our first grade class, everywhere that we teach, they know something and we gotta listen to them. It doesn't mean that they know everything. They come to learn, right? So obviously, there are things that they recognize that they still need to know or that we suggest that they need to know. But epistemic equality is a foundational democratic component of classrooms, and creating safe spaces. Don't let anyone take away this notion. It's not an embarrassment. Learning communities have to be safe spaces. It's not because students are snowflakes, it's because the capacity to act in your class depends on the knowledge that you will not be humiliated for who you are, right? And so leaving humiliation outside of the classroom, especially identity-based rejection and humiliation, is necessary for learning and growing and for expanding the boundaries of knowledge, right? So again, inclusion and knowledge or belonging and truth are tied together in a learning community. So, to summarize where we are at in this relationship between polarization and democracy. Is polarization very bad for democracy? It's pretty bad, because growing shares, I'm reading you the little letters here, growing shares of both Republicans and Democrats say members of the other party are immoral, dishonest, close-minded, unintelligent, lazy, right? So we have pretty bad visceral opinions about members of the other party. This is what in research is sometimes called either affective polarization or ideological contempt, right? Not good. So this we have to overcome. At the same time, we have to remember that polarization actually has a positive impacts on democracy in two ways. Polarization creates greater engagement. We all know that. We walk out to the streets. We register to vote. We get animated by the effects of polarization, by trying to keep these supposed immoral, dishonest, and whatever other bad things, people from getting power, right? So we are more engaged. And by the way, we know much more. We are more engaged as political actors. We are learning more. There are amazing, I decided that's enough graphs for one philosopher, but there are amazing jumps in surveys of political knowledge since 2016. people just know more. Why? Because they think it's gonna kill them, you know, like they really want, you know, they wanna understand what is happening. And so polarization is a real problem for democracy in all of the ways I described. But what we need to be able to do is to overcome polarization without giving up on the knowledge and engagement, right? This is the challenge. We have to figure out a way not to hate each other, but still to remain engaged and still to remain knowledgeable about the process. And really, this virtuous cycle that is described here, developing trust in reciprocal ways, cooperating towards good governance and equal citizenship, really this virtuous cycle is the way out, and it's a virtuous cycle that really can most primarily be generated in schools and universities. This is where we can make it happen, because this is where we have sustained engagement across time around shared goals, right? This is where it's at. You know, researchers like Elinor Ostrom are telling us how groups can de-bias individuals, right? Diverse groups can really teach us how to be better in terms of our understanding and our engagement. And so we can become less polarized without becoming disengaged. Building democracy from the ground up, really at the community level, calls for borrowing sugar. This is just one of my favorite cartoons about this. Can I borrow a cup of sugar? I'm trying to stave off loneliness, stop runaway climate change, and make bran muffins. Even though we can get the sugar delivered to our house in no time with Instacart, borrowing sugar from your neighbors really allows for you to create these kinds of weak ties that are sustaining democracy. This is really more at the general social or community level. At the college level, we can really do that in our classrooms through engaged learning of the type that was discussed here this morning, right? Based on both facts and on the inclusion of diverse voices in our classroom. Connections beyond our class in clubs and other organizations, both identity-based and coalitional. Groups like the Civil Discourse group in this, at this university, and the similar efforts that are taking place both within colleges and universities around the country. It's really everywhere, and it's marvelous. As well as engagement with, and I know that some of you guys are engaging with a local community group for conversations across difference. Braver Angels, Bridges USA. I mean, there are a lot of organizations that are doing this work that is very important for colleges to engage with, and always to be open to engaging with a discussion about the boundaries of what is acceptable. It's not easy. So I'm not trying to say this is like some kind of introducing unicorns and butterflies into our college campuses. This is my campus this past Monday, I think. So here is Ben Franklin over here watching a little bit in horror as a group of street preachers is I know you have visits from these groups as well, sending everyone to hell because they are gay or engaged in cross-racial relationships or having sex or all sorts of reasons. And over here, an encampment of some of our students calling to divest from fossil fuels. So very diverse types of civic engagement, all of them posing challenges to our provost and the university administration. But all of them really just calling on us to engage with views and opinions outside of our own community and outside of our own minds, and figuring out the boundaries of what is acceptable. What is the law allow? What does the law allow? What does our community favor? And doing all of that is necessary for building common ground and democratic renewal. Professor McAvoy this morning offered some questions about specific topics, and I will say very broadly that when we are looking to engage across difference, we can start off by asking, what do we share? What do we all share? What do we know? What do we want to know, right? Asking each other, tell me a little bit more about that, right? And then creating in this way opportunities for civic, social, and learning connections. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I mean, there's just so much there that's, of course, rich and just ready for our discussion. But before we get into that discussion, we're now in for another treat. OSU's own Provost Melissa Gilliam will offer us a short set of remarks before joining in conversation with Professor Ben-Porath. A scholar, physician, educator, and an academic leader. Dr. Gilliam has held leadership positions across various institutional types. As a scholar, she conducts domestic and international research addressing adolescent health and education by using technology, design, and narrative. And I'll also here resist naming even a portion of the long list of awards that have been offered. As Ohio State's Executive Vice President and Provost, Dr. Gilliam is the Chief Academic Officer of one of the largest and most comprehensive universities in this country. Among other initiatives that serve the roughly 67,000 students, nearly 8,000 faculty, and perhaps countless staff members of OSU's community, Dr. Gilliam has led the Office of Academic Affairs in the Civil Discourse Project, aimed at supporting students, faculty, and staff in learning about civil discourse and practicing the skills needed to engage with the different views and opinions that they might encounter. Given that work and that context, I think that you'll all agree with me that we're excited to hear what she has to say about this very important topic. So please do join me in welcoming Provost Melissa Gilliam.
Thank you, Dr. Thompson. Hello, everyone. It's such a pleasure to be here with you today. And I want to thank the Center for Ethics and Human Values for hosting this event. And I especially want to thank our speaker, Dr. Ben-Porath. Porath? You answered anything for your remarks and for being here today. It's really just been wonderful. So in the few minutes I have with you, I want to take a moment to focus on how academic freedom of expression and inclusion go hand in hand. And this is such an important topic for us at Ohio State. I think the reason I have particular knowledge about this topic is that in my previous institution, it's probably my very first day as an administrator, and we were sitting around the table starting to get to know each other, and someone said, "Is something going viral?" And what had happened is we had an associate dean for the college who had decided to write a letter to our incoming students saying, there are no safe spaces at the University of Chicago. And it went viral all around the world. It was, it's sort of one of those things where you say, where the communications people might have liked it, but it was a pretty rude awakening on your first day in a new job. And so it was a campus that was talking about how important free speech is. And really it is one of the most important issues in higher education. And it comes from a tradition of thinking about academic freedom and the ability to study and talk about what we want on a college campus. And this is absolutely critical to the scholarly pursuits that we have. Being able to study what you want to study, having people challenge your ideas, and we understand within the bounds and the way that we think about academia, it helps our scholarship become that much richer and our ideas become that much more precise. And this is something I think we do very well at this institution. We have a willingness to listen and to understand ideas. And this carries us outside of the classroom. We sit outside of the classroom, we talk to our colleagues. And again, it's something I believe in wholeheartedly. And I remember as a college student, I lived across the landing from, I think his name was Richard, but he was Judge Richard Posner's son. And so he has two sons. Eric Posner is a little more progressive, and so this was the more, this was the other son. And we used to speak well into the evenings, and we had very different viewpoints. But it was everything from guns and religion to whatever. And regularly we would talk about these issues. And I realized that I never felt a sense of anger or frustration. We just didn't agree. And I learned a lot. I learned how to argue. I learned different perspectives. And I reflect back on being able to have these conversations and not feel undermined. And I think it came from having a profound sense of safety and belonging and sense of my identity as a student. And so I want to talk a little more about these ideas of belonging and identity. But as you heard, that the political tides have changed. And so this idea of having the safety and privilege of academic freedom really has been challenged. And so I think the question arises, how do we think about academic freedom in the context of the university, freedom of expression within a university? And I think we have to think about two questions. The first is, are there boundaries? And then, how might these boundaries vary from how we think about the First Amendment and freedom of expression and free speech? And are there ways that we can build skills to engage in free expression? And so the notion of boundaries, I think, are actually manifested in many of the initiatives that we have in the Civil Discourse project. And so I'm really proud of the unique lens that Ohio State brings to this topic. So I started off by saying there are no safe spaces, but think about Ohio State. When I first came, people said, "Welcome to Buckeye Nation." I thought, well, what's that? There is a friendliness here and a kindness and a goodwill that I think makes this a special place and a particular place where we might be able to engage in this idea of respectful deliberation, that it seems to be part of what this university is about. The other dimension is this idea of skill building. Can we build our skills around civil discourse, but also around issues of inclusion? And these, I think, are both really rich toolkits that enable us to listen across differences. And so I would almost argue that this common point of boundaries and skill building causes almost for a radical sense of belonging, really focusing on what it means to belong. And so I think we have an opportunity to talk more about these ideas this morning, but also to do this looking forward. So I have just been so delighted to be introduced to the Center for Ethics and Human Values. And Piers has spent a lot of time with me working through these ideas and what it means and what we are trying to do here at Ohio State. And Winston, you've been a great colleague in this process as well. And so there are also many Ohio State initiatives, whether that's the Institute for Democratic Engagement and Accountability, which is focusing on studying and fostering high-quality political dialogue and deliberation. There's also the Divided Community Project, again, working outside of the institution, but also inside of the institution, especially around these issues of divisiveness and trying to think about collaboration and progress. And then more recently, bringing these three groups together in what you've heard of as the Civil Discourse Project. And this is really an institutional effort to try to think about how these ideas around civil discourse can prepare us to be citizens both of this university but of a larger democracy. I'd like to just end where Dr. Porath also ended, which is this idea that we have the opportunity to encourage open-minded exploration, which is absolutely critical to the academic mission and the privilege we have given the rich diversity that the 70,000 students and almost 8,000 faculty. But I mean, think about it, 100,000 of us here on this campus as Buckeyes. Think about the amazing diversity that we have here and what we could do if we can listen and learn across our differences. It's really quite astounding. And then thinking about what happens as we emerge from this institution and start to influence our democratic society. So I think we'll have time to speak to one another. But again, thank you so much for this time and for being here, and also for this opportunity to think about this concept of civil discourse.
Thank you so much. Just really terrific. And I'd like to now invite both of you to the front of the room here as we have a little bit of a conversation. Thank you so much, Kate. Yeah, the chairs are mobile. So I want to be... so we're talking here about, how to speak with one another, how to converse with one another. So I do want to make sure that we have ample time to hear from people who are in the audience. But before we get there, let me just sort of engage with the two of you and invite you to a bit of a conversation. Professor Ben-Porath, your work in Cancel Wars forwards a prescriptive view, of how universities in general might proceed on matters of free expression. Provost Gilliam, your Civil Discourse Project aims to address some very related concerns on the specific, in this specific context of Ohio State University, and about how we might best speak with and listen to one another. I suppose, as I think about the ideals that kind of drive both of these projects, I want to invite both of you to say a little bit of something about the obstacles to doing this work, right? It's, we heard we saw the mission accomplished banner offered in jest, but there's hard work to be done here. How should we understand some of these obstacles?
You first.
Whomever.
So,
you might need to turn. Yep.
Yeah. So the idea behind the Civil Discourse Project is to work with these organizations and create a forum for discussing topics that are currently things that are polarized. So what are the barriers? I tend to think in socio-ecologic models, so I'll just kind of use that framework. So I think the first is really at the individual level. We come from in very, very different backgrounds. Some of us have had the opportunity to engage deeply in civil discourse and discussion across ideas. For others, the ideas that are being discussed are kind of right there, right in your face. These are things that you've had personal experience with. They are topics that many of us are minoritized along. And so what might be an intellectual conversation for one person is a deep-rooted experience for another. And so when you say, please sit and calmly have this conversation, it is at a personal level. For many people, it's quite untenable. The next piece is really and when I say it untenable, what we know is that experiences with whether it's polarization or ideas or personal violence that you've experienced, these are things that actually sit within our bodies. They're not just, oh, it would be nice to think differently about this. Ideas, concepts, experiences, they get under our skin. They are things that affect us biologically and socially. And so when we say we'd like to have a civil conversation about race or another topic that is your identity, that is an incredibly challenging thing that we're asking of people. So I think that's the first, is that where people are coming from and their actual experience. I think the second is the social climate that we're living in. These are things that for politicians is how one gets votes, and you know, it's as opposed to kind of the things you stay away from in polite conversation. The idea is to go directly into them because they know that they evoke this level of emotion and will drive your vote. So this thing that you've been taught to work kindly with one another around, it is actually something that benefits and creates power dynamics. And so there is a social aspect that actually prevents us from getting to engage in civil discourse. And then I think the other barrier is that the political winds and the events of the external world continue to change. And so, you know, we can be in this moment, and then we have the midterm elections, and then we have major wars, and we have outbreaks. And so it's not just something where this is static and we can build these skills and then we do fine and we can sit in this moment. Then the next event comes. And we're in the midst of, we're dealing with a pandemic, and we're dealing with crises around mental health, and we felt incredibly isolated. So the barriers are quite significant. And then, as you have spoken about, there are also structural barriers that reinforce these. And so, as you know, even in the state of Ohio, we are trying to not only deal with legislation around free expression that tries to codify some of the issues that are arising, but we're also dealing with the actual effects of effective polarization, whether it's book banning or whether it's what we've seen in city councils or actually silencing faculty members or trying to get rid of tenure. These are actual things that are interrupting what we are trying to do in the university setting.
So much for your depressing slides, right?
Here. I mean, yeah. I definitely think a lot about the legislation. And I just want to say, so I agree with everything you said. I will add one point about the political or legislative efforts to restrict speech. Those are a concern for the reasons you've mentioned. And they are also a concern because the engagement around what the boundaries of expression should be, the engagement around the norms of conversation that we are having in our classrooms and in our institutions is a very important aspect of our civil action today, right? Because we are so polarized, right? Just engaging around questions of how might we talk about American history, or how might we talk about our public spaces and monuments, how might we think about all of these things. These are moral and civic actions that we are taking as individuals and as forming communities, and I mean really small communities, even if it's your seminar or your club or something. And so the effort to top-down define for everyone what can and cannot be said, I think is in itself undermining civic engagement and democratic learning, right? And so that's, I think we have to remain open to negotiating our norms and boundaries and what fits our institution. You know, what works for Ohio State doesn't necessarily work for Kenyon, even though it's really not that far, right? And in the same legislative environment, and this, you know, it's a different community. They're trying to do something different over there. So they should be able to negotiate their own. And if the legislature is defining that for you all, then it means that you cannot do the work that you need to do as a community.
So this is really, really terrific. It's for me generating some thoughts about the ways in which these institutions, our universities, are dynamic and they exist within this greater social and political context. And the work that must be done certainly seems as though it's a very it must be responsive to what's happening in the world. So I suppose I want to just kind of pick up on a thread that I just heard in that last comment, which is different universities are trying to do different things. And it occurs to me that perhaps, universities have a very unique role to play in our democracy. And so I want to invite both of you to say something about what that role ought to be, right? And on that question, I suppose we might ask ourselves whether or not that role is sort of a constant role. Universities play a role in society regardless of what's happening outside of the gates of the institution. Or perhaps it's the case that universities, really do need to fundamentally shift in thinking about their role in a world where, as we were talking about earlier, there's disinformation and misinformation, and it's the case that folks can't agree upon facts. So I'm curious, as we sit here on the campus of such an institution, how should we be thinking about a public flagship institution and its role in a democracy?
Right. So I would say that higher education as a sector and then individual universities have to keep in mind two roles. One role has to do with their own constituents, right, with their own membership, their students, their faculty. And so the role here really has to do with the kind of thing that both of us just talked about, creating communities where you are included, where these barriers or hurdles are overcome together, where we are able to discuss ideas and develop knowledge and transmit it to our students and beyond, right? So this is more of an internal role. But universities also are supposed to be working and are working in a service of their broader community, society, or the world. When you develop knowledge about various topics, you are really contributing it outside. I mean, that's your goal. You're not looking to hoard it. You're looking to share it, right? And in that role, we do have to remember that the people who are coming through our gates as a sector, right, are a fraction of each age cohort, right? Most people end up not going to or not completing college, right, in each age cohort. And so what we need to try and do is to create the broader social conditions that are beneficial to others as well. If we are to have a positive role in our democracy and in the world, then the knowledge that we develop has to be disseminated, but also the opportunities that we develop have to be disseminated in various forms as well. This is a shifting role, as you were just indicating, but in my view at this time, an important aspect of this role is taking a leadership position, socially speaking, in regards to the ways in which our democracy is being eroded, right? So colleges and universities, students, faculty, administrators, boards, right? All of them have a role to play in stemming the backsliding of democracy today. And this role looks a little bit differently for undergraduates or for the provost or for anyone, right, who's taking part in it. But we all have a role in it. As I said, we cannot, as I tried to indicate, we cannot stay above the fray. We are a part of this divided structure and culture right now, and we have the context that can turn it around. And we have to do it internally with our own membership, and we have to do it outwardly by advocating for the kind of values that we stand on values that are based on evidentiary practices, are based on creating inclusive communities, are based on advancing truth and knowledge for the betterment of society. That's a little bit grand, I recognize, but this is the mission of the institution, and we have to not only live by it, but we have to speak it out.
So I think the first thing that comes to mind for me is thinking about what it means to be a learner and pursuing truth and knowledge. If you think about Ohio State, we have College Credit Plus, so we can have people on this campus as young as probably 14, 15. And so think about this developmental moment where we have an opportunity to establish knowledge, thinking, even reaching into high school in this environment. I mean, it's quite incredible. And so one thought is that this should be enduring, not shifting according to the political winds, but enduring. What it means to be a university, this idea of helping young people learn to think and learn to learn from one another in this really complex environment from all of these different people. That to me should be sacrosanct and we should try to keep that far away from the political winds, even though the topics that we are studying and learning about should shift. And so there's a part that is where we should resist, right? And we should very much resist the context and draw upon our enduring values, even though we will continue to question what happened before at Ohio State and the decisions that were made. But we cannot help but be part of larger political and other shifts. And part of that, I think, is the need to be responsive to our environment. Very much what you're saying in terms of our ability to speak out and say what our values are and say what we care about. But we also have the opportunity to learn from the diverse young people who are coming through and who are saying, this is what we need to know about, this is what is affecting our lives, and we are going out to be future citizens, and we have to not just think we have this moment when we're in a bubble, but how are we going to think about and how are we going to think about our role in democracy? So the more that we bring those ideas into our campus and grapple with them in a safe environment where we can learn to think and learn to question and learn to challenge and sharpen our ideas and viewpoints, to me, that is critical and a critical part of a land-grant institution. And I think the last piece has been this assault on higher education, and it has higher education and the value of a 4-year degree is being questioned. And again, I think this is an opportunity for us to not necessarily defend the value proposition, and that I've had those terms kind of levied at me. What's the value proposition of a 4-year education? But it is, I think, an opportunity for us to actually be actively engaged in questions of the important questions of the day and to problem solve around the important questions of the day, whether that is climate change or whether that is income inequality or healthcare or mental health and disparities, but also to show that in this environment, with this diversity of perspectives, backgrounds, ideas, these are probably some of the best think tanks that you're going to find. And so I think we can not necessarily move with the political winds, but I do think we can respond to the challenges of these political times, because that is what universities have done over this very long period of time. And whether it is this moment of polarization or McCarthyism, or the Holocaust, or other times when the country has been in turmoil, because that is human nature, universities have offered enduring values. So, yeah.
Yes,
Yeah. No, that's just terrific. I mean, I hear in both of your comments, thoughts that call me to think about our university's motto, right? Thinking about education for citizenship and the role that, our actions here might play in the broader society in which we find ourselves. And I also hear some very elegant thoughts about how we might be responsive to one another, as well as responsive to our circumstances. With a vision to being responsive, let me invite others here to pose their questions so that we can engage with the thoughts of the group. There is a microphone here, and I'll ask that people queue in front of the microphone so that your comments are accessible to all. And if you have asked a question before, feel free to make space for someone else to ask the first question. Thank you.
Hello. I just had a question about, because I missed the first 5 minutes of the session, but I had a question about trigger warnings, because I noticed that that wasn't really brought up. I know you brought up safe spaces, so I'm curious to hear what your thoughts are on trigger warnings, especially with regard to banned books, because books don't tend to have ratings. So I know a lot of the movement behind banning books is the fact that there is no rating system for the books, so it's better just to throw them out than to put like a sticker or something on them that says like warning explicit content or something like that.
Thank you for your question. Either of you like to begin?
I have big thoughts on this. I'm happy. Sure. Thank you for this question. I'll say broadly about trigger warnings, I think they're a pretty good idea. I don't think, generally speaking, again, like with the safe spaces, they've become caught up in some odd political disagreement. In my view, if I want to, I'll give you an example. I was teaching a class on ethics to freshmen, and one of the topics was the ethics of eating meat. And so I was going to show a short video that was filmed in a meat factory. And so it's horrible, okay? So I'm giving a trigger warning, right? This is what you're gonna see. You're gonna see, animals being killed. If you can't manage that, or you don't wanna, if you wanna brace yourself, this is what's coming. Is the value of the movie more effective if I'm springing it on you without warning? I don't know. I mean, I really think if we have a conversation about it before and after, learning is actually improved. So trigger warnings, in my view, a pretty good concept. For some reason, being caught up in, this whole discussion about snowflakes, that's not interesting to me. About the books, that's more interesting. I think we always have debates about age-appropriate or developmentally appropriate materials. And this is a good conversation to have for teachers and parents. I don't want my kids reading that. I want my kids reading the other thing. My concern about the book bans right now is that this is not me coming in and saying, you know what, I don't think my kid can understand this properly. I think it's too early for them to learn about this or that topic, whether it's historical or identity-based or whatnot. This is me coming in and saying your kids and no other kids should be allowed to read this, right? So this is not a statement about development. This is a statement about values. And as I was trying to say, it's a statement about who belongs. Because if I'm not allowing books about families where there are two moms or dads, there are people in the room that are a part of this family. And I'm telling them, be quiet, right? So I'm telling them, you don't belong. So obviously there are age-appropriate ways of talking about all of these topics, whether it's talking to 4-year-olds about, hard histories in America, or about gender and sexuality, etc. I don't think trigger warnings are going to be a solution to that, because I think the problem that we are being faced with is not a problem that is about development. It's a problem about, it's an effort to shift the values that are accepted within our culture, right? So trigger warnings are good. they don't solve the book bans issues, in my view.
So I agree that, remember that letter I told you about? The other thing, it said safe space, no trigger warnings. So just to kind of put on my medical hat, people, when someone has experienced a serious trauma, it's not this idea that you're a snowflake. If something triggers a tremendous response in somebody, especially around something you've been traumatized around, that is an honest and physical and has biologic consequences for someone. And for someone to say you're a snowflake because you can't, because I'm going to warn you that this may not be something that you want to sit through, I think that is, I find that problematic. And so even in your talk, you're like, you will have 4 difficult slides here. I think it gives people an opportunity to make choices about where they are at a given moment. Other than that, I don't think I can add much to what you've said. I agree with it. And so in the interest of time, I'll let someone else ask a question.
Yeah, so any other questions from folks who may have posed questions in the past or are interested in approaching the microphone?
Hi. My question was, how do you reconcile the increase in institutional distrust of higher education and the leadership role that higher education should take in solving some of these problems?
Oh, terrific question. Yeah.
I think in some of and I appreciate the question because it's something that I am actively engaged in. And where I've ended up is leaning into these principles around civil discourse. And so I came from a private institution where we could engage in these types of debates, but they were not front and center. It wouldn't have, our funding wouldn't have depended on it. There was nothing that actually materially changed the nature of being a private institution. Versus I came willingly, I ran to Ohio State because I do think these issues are quite interesting and important at this particular moment. And it is comply because this is what the legislature said to do. And as I mentioned, it is very clear in the statistics that you just saw, there is active hostility to four-year institutions. So these are top of mind. So I actually lean into this concept of civil discourse, which is to say, I don't agree with you, your perspective, but is there any wisdom here, or is there a challenge that I might be able to contend with that actually sharpens my ability to do the work? And so we were it was a group of other people across Ohio who share my job title, and some said, oh, this is so political, or this is this, or those people. But at the other end of the day, there was also a conversation about if the challenge was, can you show us that what you do contributes to people getting jobs in Ohio? It's like, well, that's not a bad challenge to a four-year institution. And we want a more diverse STEM workforce because our society is diverse. I thought, well, I could align with that. That should be a challenge that a four-year institution could meet. Or, Intel is coming and we want more, whatever. So there was another part of it which said, okay, there are ideas here that pose challenges to me that I should be able to contend with. Now, that doesn't mean that I will agree with the arguments like the humanities are dead, or or critical race theory arguments. Those I don't have time for. But there are kernels of things that we as a four-year institution should be able to contend with. And as a land-grant institution that is committed to service, we should also be able to contend with. So that's how, for me, this idea of civil discourse, kind of, what's the music beneath the words, and how do I start to contend with those questions, which I actually think are true challenges to four-year education, four-year institutions, especially given that these are the people's tax dollars. Maybe we should be able to answer for it. So that's how I work my way through that.
And just to add one short thing about this matter, because it's really useful, right? The description of the this retreat or workshop that you were describing. In the last slide in my talk, when I was talking about building common ground, right? The first question that we need to ask is, what do we share? And this is a great example. What do we share? We share a commitment to a diverse workforce. We share a commitment to providing students with a pathway into economic success. Of course, there are values that we don't share, right, in your example, but here are things that we do share. Can we start with that, right? And so building trust, which, we have no choice. Even if we think the mistrust is sometimes misguided and has to do with disinformation about what we do, or about the role of the humanities, or about various, indoctrination or whatever nonsense that sometimes is, inappropriately describing the work that we do for them, in my view. There are still a lot of things that we can share across ideological divides, even with people who raise, concerns about the role of higher education in society. And so I think starting to build trust by asking, what do we share, right? What do we see eye to eye? That's a good way to start building common ground and to rebuilding trust in the institution and in the sector.
One thing I'll add to that is it's been very interesting to me to come to an institution, excuse me, with a football team.
Sure.
Because one of the places where you actually talk to people, and people say they get one of the few opportunities to speak against political divides. The politicians themselves, they come to the university and see the university as an opportunity for them to be in conversation with one another. And then there's also a congressional breakfast in Washington, and people say they get to come together around Ohio State. They say, we can't do this in the chambers of Congress, but we can do it because of Ohio State. So now I understand, I understand what you're saying. So thank you.
Well, that's such a wonderful image for us to settle on. I want to thank both of you so much for your time and for your thoughts this morning, and ask everyone to join me in offering a heartfelt thanks for all that you've provided as we think about the context of higher education, division, diversity, and what's possible for our democracy. Thank you all so much.